Greetings to colleagues in Argentina, all the way from the other side of the planet in India, and I hope all of you are doing well. So I'm about to give you a two-part presentation on innovation policies and technological change. The first part will provide a conceptual overview of how to think about innovation policies and technological change, while the second part will provide certain empirical evidence drawn from much of what is called the Global South and specifically from India to understand how the nature of our understanding of innovation and technological change is actually undergoing certain kinds of transformations as the scale and scope of these phenomena are changing. Okay? So, on that note, let's start. Now, if you go back almost 30 years ago, it was a momentous time when the Berlin Wall fell, right? And it was at that time when Francis Fukuyama, a professor at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. in the United States, provocatively proposed and argued that we were at the end of history. That is, the end of history to Fukuyama essentially meant the triumph of Western liberal democracy and representative government, capitalist free markets, and the consumerist culture, right? So this was, in a sense, what Fukuyama was arguing for. Now, in some sense, what Fukuyama was saying was not really new, because there's actually been a history, at least in the last 2 centuries, of the proclamation of the end of history, right? For instance, if you go back to Malthus in the early 19th century, he was a British economist who spoke of how population would grow in geometric proportion and therefore outpace growth in agricultural output, which would grow in arithmetic proportion, right? In other words, population growth would be far more rapid than agricultural growth, and he was actually foreseeing mass starvation. Another person who sort of saw the end of history in very different terms in the 19th century was Marx, who thought that capitalism would be overthrown through class struggle because of the inherent inequities of capitalism that he wrote about, and that would lay the ground for creating an ideal socialist society, right? Now, whether it is the views of Fukuyama or Marx or Malthus, the end of history hasn't really happened, in part because, you see the growing spread of nationalism and authoritarian regimes, which really challenges, claims about the sustenance of liberal democracy. And you also see the erosion of faith in capitalism itself, right, with growing inequality and inequity. So it's not that capitalism is going to be embraced very easily like Mr. Fukuyama had predicted. So what we're seeing is that the prediction of historical trajectories is not as simple as might seem at first instance. Now, in other words, despite sort of what Marx said, I mean, while Fukuyama has been proven wrong, clearly, and Marx too, but one of the reasons why Marx is proven wrong is that, despite all the experiments with socialism, for instance, in the former USSR, or in a different manner in China or in Cuba, capitalism clearly is the dominant mode of production, despite the inequities and inequalities that result in our continued pursuit. Now, Malthus was also proven wrong because agricultural production has increased tremendously, right? For instance, you had the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s, which ensured that many parts of the world that were facing starvation now increasingly had at least some access to food, even though we continue to live in a world where access to food is uneven. But the predictions of mass starvation have not proven to be valid. Now, interestingly, by 2002, Fukuyama himself had sort of changed his position, and he argued in a book that came out in the year that there could be no end of history as long as science and technology keep advancing. And he also argued that the fate of societies will actually be determined by the diverse deployments of these technologies. In other words, you have a set or a family of technologies, and different societies will learn to deploy them in different ways, and that is what is going to determine their fate. There will be no universal convergence of history. And in fact, in the second part of the presentation, we will look at the deployment of technologies in what is generally called the Global South and in India specifically, to understand how trajectories are actually being shaped, as are the fates of societies. Now, it is this sort of new technologies and their deployment, that is innovation and the supporting policies, that have proven Malthus and Marx wrong, right? Now, historically, if you look at it, it is the desire to improve aggregate productivity and standards of living that leads us to adopt technology and to innovate, because we are not doing it for its own sake. Unless we see notable changes in our standards of living, technology is, or adopting technology is fairly meaningless. Now, I think it'll be useful at this point to think of, or to use some sort of working definitions at least, of what we mean by terms such as science, technology, and innovation. Now, it is these kinds of definitions that is going to provide us with a conceptual framework to think about what technologies are about, or how they can take different forms, and how we can come up with policies, and how we can collectively, as a human race, benefit from them, even if the benefits are evident in different ways in different societies. Now, science is propositional knowledge. That is, it refers to the know what about natural phenomena and regularities. Simple. We now know that our planet revolves around the sun, whereas maybe 500 years ago, they thought it was the other way around. But now, thanks to the development of verifiable scientific propositions, we are able to say that, here is something we understand about how our planet behaves. So science is the so-called know what, as the well-known economic historian Joel Mokyr writes. Now, science can be applied to create instructional or prescriptive knowledge, or what we call know-how. And this is also what we refer to as technology, right? It is the know-how, that is how we translate our scientific understanding into something that can be applied, especially to solve certain kinds of problems, that we call technology. Now, innovation, on the other hand, encompasses the means by which firms master and get into practice of product designs and manufacturing processes that are new to them, whether or not they are new to the universe or to the nation. So you have a technology which is then taken by a firm and then transformed into a set of product designs or processes, okay, to generate certain kinds of output that is of commercial value, right? Now, this transformation, this innovation that is undertaken by the firm might not be terribly new to, to society. But as far as the firm is concerned, its unique ability to transform that technology into a product or service is innovation, at least as far as they're concerned, right? Thus, innovation is about the diffusion of technology, whether or not such technology is new, right? And therefore the need for innovation policies. In other words, even if you say you have advanced technologies, right, it's of little use if you do not have the ability to transfer that or transform the technology innovatively into products and services that are of commercial or social value. In order to facilitate or enable the transformation of technology and to sort of generate that ability to innovate in different societies, you need innovation policies. So that is sort of a way of thinking about the why of innovation policies. Now, the importance of technology and innovation has long been understood. In fact, even Marx, although he saw the oath of capitalism, talked about revolutionizing the forces of production. The only problem with Marx was he sort of underestimated the power of technology to sustain capitalism. It's not that he did not acknowledge the importance of technology and innovation. Into the 20th century, Joseph Schumpeter, right, a very well-known Austrian economist who spent a fair bit of his career at Harvard University in the US, refers to the gales of creative destruction. That is, when new technologies, products, and sources of supply and organization commands a decisive cost or quality advantage to strike not at the margins of profit or outputs of existing firms, but at their very foundations and lives. In other words, literally like a gale, it comes and sweeps through, new technologies or products can sweep through existing ways of doing things, and it tends to be a far superior means of doing things. Okay? Now, while it's nice to talk about revolutionizing the forces of production or gales of creative destruction to signify the importance of technology and innovation, it was not until Robert Solow, a Nobel Prize winning economist at MIT in the US, until Solow came along, that we were able to quantify or precisely understand the extent to which technology and innovation actually mattered, right? And what Solow did was that he took the period between 1907 and 1949 in the US and said, to what extent can the growth in the US economy in this period be attributed to increases in the two major factors of production, that is, capital and labor. After doing econometric tests, okay, Solow said that only 12.5% of the growth in the US economy in that period between 1907 and 1949 was attributable to increases in capital and labor, right? And 87.5% was what he called a statistical residue that at that time people did not know how to explain, but something that we have since come to call technological change. That residue represents technological change. Now, which means, if technology is so critical or technological change is so critical to economic growth, for the period 1907 to 1949 in the US, it accounted for 87.5% of productivity growth. So obviously it's critical, which means the next question is, how do we go about achieving it? How do we bring it about? Because all of us would like to see that kind of technological change, improvements in productivity, and a rise in the standards of living. So how do we do it? Now, in order to understand, let's turn to the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, right? In his work back in 1776, The Wealth of Nations, Smith sort of came up with this idea of a division of labor. And he sort of elaborated on this idea by using the example of a pin factory and sort of showed how we could potentially understand technological change and innovation. Right? Now, when pin assembly is broken down into a number of steps and assigned to many people, as opposed to pins being made or the entire pin being made by one person, when the manufacture of a pin is broken down into different steps and given to different people, the resulting output per worker is greater than the number of pins that each worker would have produced on their own. In other words, there are productivity improvements. Now, for any given technology of pin manufacture, the design of the pin and breaking its production into steps represents the technical division of labor. In other words, if you are able to break down the production process into 10 steps or 15 steps or whatever, that's called the technical division of labor, because that is what the technology will allow you to break down the production process into the number of steps. Now, how people with specific skills perform specific tasks is what is called the social division of labor. This refers to saying, okay, what kind of skill do I have to have in order to perform this task? Now, think of a modern firm or a company, right? So you have an accountant who does accounting work, somebody on the production line, somebody who's in sales, somebody who's in marketing. Now, the fact that you have these kinds of skills that are required means that you have a social division of labor. Then, finally, you have what is known as the spatial division of labor, which refers to where design and production actually takes place, right? Is it in India? Is it in Argentina? Within Argentina, is it in Buenos Aires or is it in Rafaela? Where it is, it's possible that some steps in production take place in one city, other steps in the production takes place in another, and that is what we refer to as the spatial division of labor. Now, we turn to sort of thinking about how to promote technology and innovation with this little background of what Smith tells us. Now, technology itself can come from the application of science to create new products and services, right? We do science, but science is relatively abstract knowledge, but then you have to convert it into the know-how, right? And innovation is what is that which brings about changes in the division of labor, the technical along with the social and spatial, irrespective of new technology, right? So whether or not you have new technology, when you say you're innovating, consciously or unconsciously, you start to bring about changes in the division of labor, at least in the social and spatial. You might say, oh, I get better skills to innovate in another part of the country. So I go there. So that automatically means you're searching for new skills in a different part. Therefore, there's simultaneous change in the social and spatial division of labor, even if there is no change in the technical division of labor. Thus, if you want to foster innovation, it requires generating new technology by applying science. nurturing relevant skills to work with and find application for new technologies, encouraging the growth of new organizations to bring together new technologies and relevant skills. So you might have a large vertically integrated company in some cases, whereas if you want to sort of work with new technologies or sort of innovate even with existing technologies for new applications, you might prefer a startup, for instance. So you have new organizational forms that may be required. You then have to identify places with the social and political circumstance to support firms and new institutional actors so that they can come together productively, right? So some locations find a supporting sort of political environment where the politicians, the bureaucrats are saying, no, we'll help you. Others are less so. So then you have to find those kinds of locations to innovate. And finally, you also need to create new markets, because even if you come up with wonderful products, if nobody sees the value, then commercially you can't go very far. Thus, the division of labor is also limited by the extent of the market. In other words, even if productivity improves, if you can't sell it, then improving productivity by changing division of labor is pretty pointless. Okay. Now, since innovation, depends on many factors. I mean, you could do one of many things that we talked about or that were listed in the previous slide. But what it also sort of points to, that innovation depends on many factors, and that the full extent of productive improvements as a result are not immediately apparent after introduction of a new technology, either at a social or a firm level. So what happens is that because it's a messy process, you're trying to figure out new technologies, who are the kinds of people who can work with it, where is it that you can best get the work done, how do you create markets, and so on. It's not a simple process. So it actually takes time, right? That's what we're referring to. Indeed, again, if you go back to into history, after the development of the dynamo in the 1880s, it took until the 1920s to fully understand how to reorganize workflows when substituting electric power for older sources of energy such as steam. So if you go to factories in the 1880s, before there was widespread electricity generation and transmission, most factories were organized using steam power. Now that required a certain kind of logic and layout in the factories. But with the coming of electricity, the nature of machinery changed, the locational requirements changed, because you no longer had to be next to, say, a canal, okay, to turn a water turbine. So, but it took people a while to actually figure out how to depreciate older machinery, how to incorporate machinery with electric technology into their workflow, and what that might mean for production and productivity. Coming to more recent times, Robert Solow, the same economist we referred to earlier, talked about the productivity paradox. In fact, when the computers first started to make an appearance from the late 70s, early 80s, and after especially the arrival of the PC, Solow wrote, we see the computer everywhere on desks at homes and offices and in hospitals and universities and so on. We see the computer everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, right? The data doesn't seem to reflect our adoption of technology. Now, this sort of paradox reflects the systemic nature of many technologies and the need for complementary investments and intangible and often hard to measure organizational changes, right? Now, let's talk about complementary investment first, and then we'll talk about hard to measure organizational changes. For instance, if you can think about a simple example like the car, we can't think of the car or the automobile without having complementary investments in things like gasoline stations, right? just like today, we are saying electric vehicles will not be widespread and will not find easy adoption unless we are able to set up charging stations so that the batteries can be charged, right? So that's a complementary investment. And those investments will not appear magically, but will take time. Think about organizational changes, right? So when the computer first came, or before the computer first came, in many offices or in most offices, you had a large pool of typists who type letters. But with the computer appearing on virtually everybody's desk, that segment of the workforce disappeared, right? And in an earlier generation, when electricity first came, or before electricity came, factories would end their workday when it became dark. But once electricity was made available, you could actually work 24 hours, right? So these are organizational changes that we start to think about and whose potentials we start to understand, and that understanding takes time. For firms, managerial choices, the nature of knowledge, intellectual property protection, and the asset structure of the firm impact the business enterprise's ability to capture value from innovation. In other words, you got to figure out what kinds of decisions to make with new innovations. How do you protect intellectual property? Okay, what is now an important asset, what is not? In the earlier days, typewriters might have been useful assets. They no longer are, right? And even now, given the pace at which technologies are changing, even a 6-month-old laptop or a computer is not necessarily a very valuable asset. So our conceptualization of what it is that sort of forms the basis for production, productivity, etc., has to change, and it takes time, right? So that is why Solow pointed out to the productivity paradox. Now, another way of sort of representing the productivity paradox is to think in terms of what is called the diffusion, right? Now, Everett Rogers, who was a thinker and scholar of innovation, many years ago, came up with this very famous S-curve, right? So what he said was that typically, I know he studied the diffusion of a number of technologies, especially in the US, and he said typically, for any new technology, you have a set of early adopters, right? Sorry about that. You have a set of early adopters, and they sort of are the ones who are actually trying and testing what the technology is capable of. Once their ability to sort of work with these things becomes more well known, then the shape of the curve becomes like a steep, it becomes very steep. And initially, it rises very slowly, whether it's this technology or this, right? Or innovation. Once a certain point is reached, the adoption of the technology or the diffusion of the innovation becomes very rapid, right? This is when what he refers to as takeoff. And then once it reaches a certain point, when a large number of sort of potential users have started using it, then it starts to taper off when you have late adopters who typically move in, and that's when it sort of the curve starts to flatten, right? Now this is typically a sort of a stylized model of how innovation takes place. And here is an instance, or here is an illustration of how different technologies diffuse through the US in the 20th century. So you can see that they are sort of more or less S-curves. They're not precise S-curves. In some cases, for instance, you take radio, it took a much longer time to diffuse, whereas if you take the case of TVs, you see that between 1945 and about 1960, in a period of 15 years, more than 80% of the American population had access to television sets. And since the 1990s, you also see the internet sort of growing quite sharply, right? The diffusion of the internet. Okay. Now, you remember that I had earlier mentioned that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Now, what we will do in the next few slides is to start to think about how is it that over the last 200 to 250 years, we managed on one hand to develop new technologies, innovations, and at the same time managed to create a market so that supply side forces and demand side forces could actually intersect to ensure that there was significant advances in sort of productivity and standards of living. Of course, let me emphasize that this was not uniform all over the world, but at least in some pockets, right? You witness a very sharp increase in standards of living. And overall, if you see in the last 200 to 300 years, or at least since the Industrial Revolution, the increase in standards of living have been historically unparalleled, and especially in the 20th century. So it's sort of just useful to understand why is it that in human history, which is at least 5,000 years old, the last 200 years have been especially unique or special, right? Now, until the year about 1400, right, the 15th century, China was the world's technological leader, right? And it had developed technologies like gunpowder and printing and silks and so on and so forth. But with the advent of modern science following European Enlightenment, leadership gradually shifted to the West, right? And I mean Europe. And in Europe, at the same time, there was a major sort of an organizational shift within society as feudal societies in Europe started to break down. You started to witness the rise of absolutist monarchies. Feudalism as the dominant mode of production started to give way to capitalism, and it laid the sort of the institutional foundation or what we now refer to as the first industrial revolution, and this happened in the late 18th century. At that time, the first industrial revolution was centered around Britain, especially in northern England, around the cities like Manchester and Leeds, and the sort of the primary technology was sort of steam power, with new technologies that also developed around steam power, such as textile machinery, railways, and telegraph. And at that time, these technologies, their sort of new products, were all developed not by using anything that we might now call modern science, right? Most of it was done through trial and error, right? So you hear of James Watt watching the kettle boil and saying, oh, I now have understood something about how steam power works, okay? But this is sort of the era when we started to rely on science, and that became a basis for new technologies, centered, like I said, on steam power and a whole new set of products such as textile machinery and so on. You also saw craft production being replaced with mass production. So where you would previously produce only sort of small numbers typically for a wealthy elite or the royal court, you suddenly, because of the availability of machinery and a major source of energy in the form of steam power, you had mass production that became possible. But this raised the question, if mass production becomes possible, okay, it will demand large quantities of raw materials, and it will also demand mass markets for its valorization. You have to sell what you're producing. Now, for the first industrial revolution, the answer to these challenges, that is, of finding vast quantities of raw material and finding mass markets for valorization, the answer was actually colonialism, right? And the non-capitalist world was brought under capitalist relations of production to serve as new sources of material and as markets. As Lenin famously wrote, imperialism represented the highest form of capitalism, right? So you see, for example, the British went and conquered most of the world. They had cotton coming in from places as far as Virginia in the southern US to Egypt to India, and in their and their vast colonies, right, which spanned the entire globe, also served as markets for many of the products that were emerging from the textile mills of Lancashire or from the manufacturing plants in the English Midlands, right? Now, the first industrial revolution, right, started to sort of lose steam, literally, by the late 19th century. And one of the reasons was that, colonialism was no longer able to provide the answer to markets, because by the late 19th century, and you all know this well, Latin America became increasingly sort of, was willing to say goodbye and become independent. And there was also another set of reasons, and this had to do with the fact that around that time, the late 19th, early 20th centuries, you had a whole new generation of sort of technologies and innovations. You had the availability of a new source of power, which is electricity, which I mentioned earlier, and you had a whole slew of products, right? The internal combustion engine, flight, and the Wright brothers, for instance, chemicals. And most of these, very different from the first industrial revolution, were developed with the formal application of science in industrial laboratories. So, for instance, you had General Electric setting up its labs in Schenectady in upstate New York, and you had Philips setting up its labs in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, Siemens in Berlin, and so on and so forth, where there was an increasingly granular social division of labor, because now with increasing availability of science and forming the basis for technologies, you needed to have chemists and physicists and all kinds of specialized people to work with the emerging knowledge to produce new products and services. Now, the institutional configuration also started to change with Fordism, right? To support markets for vertically integrated production facilities with tripartite national agreements between capital, labor, and state. Now, what does this mean, right? Like I said, colonialism had given way, but now you had the generation of new markets left to this sort of phenomenon that we refer to as Fordism. Okay? Now, Fordism was this tripartite agreement between capital, labor, and the state. Very simply put, capital was given control of work processes for productivity gains. So they figured out how to arrange plants, manufacturing plants, how to arrange the production facilities, and so on. Labor, for its part, was guaranteed wage increases, right? And that ensured sustained demand, because if labor was paid well, they would go out and buy all the consumer goods or the goods that the factories are producing. In fact, the name Fordism itself comes from the fact that Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, caused quite a scandal back in about a century ago when he gave the first $5 a day wage, when the prevailing wage rate was barely half of that at that time. Ford argued that unless his workers were well paid, there would be no market for his cars. Now, the state mediated between labor and capital to balance productivity gains and wage demands, in the sense that they would play the sort of the judge to saying, okay, are your demands for productivity increases fair? And then it could tell labor, okay, based on these productivity improvements, are your demands for wage increases fair, right? Now the state also supplied public goods such as education and health to ensure productivity increases. Because on one hand, like I said, with the formal application of science, you needed to have better skilled population, you needed to have well-trained people, and you started to see, therefore, the growth of university education on a large scale. It was no longer just an elite preoccupation. And at the same time, you needed to also have better health facilities because, people like Charles Dickens and others wrote famously, the first industrial revolution took place in absolutely appalling conditions where, longevity was very limited, and one simply didn't know if a worker left for home, whether he or she would return the next morning alive to work as productively the next day. So you needed to have health facilities in the form of public health. Urban planning started to play a big role, right, to have hygienic sort of living conditions and so on. And all of this was provided by the state because it was sort of collective or public goods and to ensure public welfare. And that's partly where the name welfare state comes. Okay? But so this sort of the second revolution, industrial revolution, along with its technologies, goods and services, sort of chugged along very well till about the 1970s, when again markets started saturating because the second industrial revolution generated a whole series of products like automobiles and washing machines and so on. But let's face it, right? Especially in the wealthy world and anywhere, I suppose, you can maybe have 2 washing machines or 3. You will not likely have 25 washing machines at home. So over a period of time, increasingly in many societies, these products were saturated and the S-curve had sort of flattened out, right? And the 1970s also were witness to sort of sluggish economic growth, and there was the first oil crisis, and which essentially meant that the combination of saturated markets with rising energy prices and so on, it meant that there was something that needed to be done to sort of increase momentum in terms of economic growth, or things would become very slack. In fact, there was a lot of clash, especially in Europe and North America at that time, between labor and capital, simply because capital was not able to sort of generate adequate productivity improvements because markets had saturated, but labor kept saying, that's not our problem, we need higher wages, right? And so this led to a number of strikes, and that period, it was generally a very difficult decade from an economic point of view. But while all this was sort of going on, what you might call the seeds of the germ for the third industrial revolution were being quietly laid, right? And those seeds had been planted back in 1949, right? With the development of the transistor at AT&T Bell Labs in New Jersey, in the United States, which was followed by the microprocessor in 1971, the personal computer in the late 1970s, and the commercialization of the internet in 1993. In other words, you were seeing this technological rejuvenation driven by microelectronics, which nobody had really anticipated. So despite the troubles in the 1970s, no one knew that there was this big storm, this wave of sort of creative destruction that Schumpeter talked about was about to sweep through our entire planet and completely change how we do things, right? So what it did was that you had increasingly powerful, affordable, and general-purpose information and communication technologies find applications in diverse domains such as banking, governance, or healthcare. In other words, this technology, ICTs or IT if you prefer, was not just a technology in itself, but like electricity in the earlier generation or steam power in the first industrial revolution. It was a general purpose technology, by which we mean it finds application in various areas. So whether you're in a classroom today, or whether you're in a hospital, or whether you go to a government office, you see computers everywhere. You have things like e-governance and electronic records, and you have the integration of manufacturing production workflows, none of which would be possible but for ICTs, right? So you see this fundamental sort of transformation that is taking place. Institutionally, you also had in the 1980s something called the Washington Consensus, which started to emphasize and sort of give great importance to free markets, private property, and individual incentives. And it also sort of pushed for easier capital flows, and it enshrined a liberal trade regime in the form of the World Trade Organization. Essentially, the Washington Consensus, by which we mean the consensus reached between three key institutions in Washington, D.C., the IMF, the World Bank, and the U.S. Treasury, institutions which people like you in Argentina and like us in India are very familiar with for the work that they do, for better or worse. They started to sort of emphasize, saying we have to free up the markets. That's the only way we're going to transform the economic stagnation of the 1970s. We need greater sort of capital flows, foreign direct investment, etc. Now, interestingly, that the goals of the WTO, like sort of capital flows and free markets, would not have been easy, but for the fact that they could be facilitated by ICTs, right? So, in other words, what ICTs did was they connected the entire sort of planet, right? And it sort of managed to create a new global economy that worked as a single unit in real time on planetary scale, right? So in other words, if you bought a t-shirt from Benetton in Rafaela, okay, immediately that is noted in the Benetton headquarters in Italy. And then probably some factory in Malaysia or China or India is told saying, oh, size maybe, X in color, red color has to be, one of them was sold, so we need to sort of fulfill inventory. So that's sort of, the flow of ideas, the capital, everything sort of at work for you, thanks mostly to ICTs. So the new institutional regime and technology reinforced one another, right? Now, the epicenter of the third industrial revolution was, of course, Silicon Valley, right? Now, the third industrial revolution brought about certain new characteristics which we had not seen earlier, right? And the primary characteristic was blurred boundaries. In other words, this meant flat hierarchies of firms, very blurred boundaries between firms, rather than saying this is, rather than operating in silos, and relationships between firms and other institutions in the region in Silicon Valley. So you have very close relationships between the university, between firms in the valley and universities such as Stanford, the University of California, Berkeley, and other sort of players in the ecosystem like, venture capitalists, IP lawyers, and so on. And they all sort of interact with one another constantly. Now, blurred boundaries have created a relatively free flow of ideas, often informal, between a technical community of researchers who identify as much with the profession as with any firm in the region. That is, I take great pride in being a computer scientist or an electrical engineer and not just working for company X or Y, right? So there's a professional identity and pride, and that allows this community to exist despite the competition between the firms, right? Sharing among a vertically decentralized network of firms allows the region to collectively define new technologies. by drawing on the science from the universities. And what happens is the protocols, the standards to which new technologies have to work are often defined in Silicon Valley in conjunction with the science that is generated at the universities. In other words, they are defining the new technologies, right, collectively. And then each firm takes it upon itself to innovate and generate specific products and services based on technologies that they are defining as an industry collectively, the science for which comes from the university. Now, despite a global economy, presence in Silicon Valley is an asset thanks to mentoring, right? So you learn from one another. Now, presence in Silicon Valley hardly guarantees success, right? Going there doesn't mean your firm will be successful, but it makes success more likely because you are in the middle of things, developments, and you can pick up on new trends and so on, rather than sitting in some other corner of the world where you may not read it, after things have happened. Now, so when I say blurred boundaries and the sharing of ideas, see, until the second industrial revolution, you had what you might refer to as a closed paradigm of industrial R&D, right? So essentially, you have research and then you have development, right? Research, you develop the technology, where you identify the technologies, perfect the technologies, and in development, you actually innovate to create products and services for the market, right? But the firm itself is like a hard line. In other words, all the research takes place within the firm. They take a number of ideas, technologies, and then depending on what the market needs, the funnel narrows on the other side, and a few of those technologies find applications as innovations and products and services, and it goes into the market. But it all takes place within the firm, whether it's the research or the development. But what we're seeing now, and this is what is perfected at Silicon Valley, which makes the region so interesting, is that you have an open innovation paradigm. In other words, you do have research, you do have development, and but what is happening is, as the boundaries of the firm becomes blurred, you see firms are saying, it's not that we're going to do everything within our boundaries. We'll borrow ideas from outside, right? Likewise, we will also take ideas from outside in order to innovate. It all doesn't have to come from our own research. And some of the research in our firm can also be taken and adopted by other firms to generate their own products and services, right? So the advantage of this, or what this acknowledges, is that no one firm has everything or all the knowledge that it takes to develop new technologies and to innovate, right? And we work very well when we do so collectively, and we can do that without sacrificing our individual interests and incentives. So this is a better representation of how Silicon Valley works rather than the old sort of closed industrial model. So yeah, so the contrasting principles of closed and open innovation. Closed innovation, the smart people in our field work for us. Whereas in open innovation, not everybody who's smart works for us. We need to work with smart people inside and outside our company, right? And then to profit from R&D, we must discover it, develop it, and ship it ourselves. In the open innovation model, it says external R&D can be significant, right? Internal R&D is needed to claim some portion of that value. If we discover it ourselves, we will get to the market first. Now, that's the original idea, but now we're saying we don't have to originate the research to profit from it. Somebody else can do the research. We can benefit from it, just like somebody may profit from our research. That's okay. The company that gets an innovation to market will win. But the current thinking is building a better business model is better than getting to market first, right? You have to understand your market, and you need to build a business model that goes around it rather than simply saying, here's a set of products and services that people may not want. Then the old idea was, if we create the most and the best ideas in the industry, we will win. The new way of thinking about it is, if we make the best use of internal and external ideas, we will win, right? So it's not just our own ideas, but everybody's. finally, we should control our IP so that competitors don't profit from ideas. On the other hand, we now say we should profit from others' use of our IP. That's okay. We should buy others' IP when we don't have it, even as long as it advances our business model. So it's a much more pragmatic approach to deciding or saying what is mine or yours, right? Now, part of the sort of the reason for this sort of change in our approach to innovation and is, can be traced back at least to 1969, right, which is a landmark year for 20th century technology. On the 20th of July, of course, the Apollo 11 moon landing by Armstrong and Aldrin, and frankly speaking, despite all the excitement, the romance of going into outer space for the first time, the last manned mission was actually in 1972, on the manned mission to the moon at least. It was really a project that was developed for the Cold War, a vanity project, if you might, to show the other side, hey, we are ahead of you. But these costs became extremely hard to justify and bear, right? Especially with the US involvement in a terrible war in Vietnam, where they lost somewhere between 40 and 50,000 lives. So when you're losing a big battle on planet Earth, what are you going and conquering outer space for? But even as that was happening, there's something else that nobody sort of paid any attention to in 1969, which has had a far more transformative effect on our lives than going to the moon, right? And that was at AT&T Bell Labs, again, the same place where 20 years ago the transistor had been developed. Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie began to develop Unix, a multi-user operating system. Unix use spread rapidly as AT&T's liberal licensing to universities, open innovation at work here, led to the collaborative development of a truly open system. Example, the Berkeley Software Distribution, or BSD. Because of AT&T's liberal distribution of Unix, Unix soon became the most influential operating system as its various versions, including Linux, right, has become the most widely adopted by the world's leading computer vendors. So you see, it's played an extremely important role in the advancement of the computing industry, thanks to the AT&T saying, we'll let ideas go. And AT&T has also benefited. And there was another event also in 1969, which has had a very, very profound impact on our lives. And that was in September 1969, the birth of the internet with the first internet message processor, what we now call a router, that was delivered by the Boston firm Bolt Baranek Newman to the lab of Professor Leonard Kleinrock at UCLA in Los Angeles. The first message to pass over the internet was from here. That is on October 29, 1969. Here you see Professor Leonard Kleinrock standing next to the first router. Now, why is this important? Although this was funded, the development of the router and the internet was founded by the Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, or DARPA as it's known in the US. Diffusion of the internet became, was possible because the technologies were developed by a network of university students who later became the foremost networking experts, right? So among Leonard Kleinrock students are people like Winton Cerf, who is now the chief technology evangelist at Google, for instance, right? So the reason why the internet spread was because DARPA allowed the ideas to be worked on by university students, and it was not kept as a secret military project. Ideas flowed around, everybody benefited, including the US military. And even this sort of lecture is being transmitted from Bangalore, India, in large part because we have something called the internet that's available, right? Now, you have what you might think of as the ultimate sort of open innovation. You have open source, you have open source software, etc. To open source, even drugs are made or medicines are made through open source mechanisms these days. Now, in the area of software, commercial software typically is released by firms as closed source. In other words, users cannot make changes even if they spot any mistakes, what are called bugs, right, or defects. Now, but the availability of the internet as an electronic public domain allowed users to voluntarily cooperate to develop an open source alternative, where the source code is released with the software for anyone to use, modify, and redistribute. So, for instance, if you take Linux, right, Linux has sort of increasingly become the dominant operating system, right? Why? Because with Linux, people are saying, if the software that doesn't work, I can actually, with a little bit of knowledge, go in and make changes and fix the software. Now, public domain software is likely to be used in various ways by different users. If functional enhancements are required, or if bugs are noticed, even a technologically ignorant person can call the attention of the project community and hope that someone capable will find the problem interestingly enough to solve, thereby benefiting everyone. Open source development is a decentralized process, right? Like a bazaar. It's not like a firm at all, where there's some CEO giving the orders. It's like a bazaar where many voices and agendas are pursued, right? Now, contrast to development within a firm that is akin to cathedral building using a unique top-down master plan. Now, with this, we come to the first half of our discussion of innovation policies and technological change. Just like I said, it was just meant to give you a broad conceptual historical overview of how we think about this phenomenon, and we can now move on to the second part, right? Okay.